feel nasally.
Do you need my methyl?
Do you have some?
I think it's right behind you, actually. In the tray to the left.
These microphones really make me realize how nasally I am.
Probably worse than you. Don't put it in the nose. Just give it a sniff.
Woo!
Jeez.
Okay.
Good stuff.
Woo!
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Plot Matrix Season 1, Episode 4. My name is Jackson Casimiro, your host, and this is Brian Smail III, your screenwriter. This is a follow-along screenwriting podcast where over the course of a season, we are writing a script with your help. Just to recap, we are writing a movie about a fictional treasure hunt industry this season. Last week, Brian and I brainstormed the history and rules of the treasure company, and this week, he is presenting a more detailed historical timeline of the Linwood Treasure Company. Okay, Brian, how are you doing today?
I really anticipated that this was going to be like a 5-minute recap of the history, and then I got working as my homework on this entire timeline, and I probably went a little bit too intense for just our backstory, but I'm feeling pretty good. I'm actually pretty excited to see what you think about the over 200-year history of the Linwood Treasure Company.
Yeah, you went full McGraw-Hill, full social studies on this.
Yeah.
It's quite a lie here. We got real names and dates for everything. We got historical references. So I think before too long, we should just get into it.
I do want to give credit really quickly to my AP Euro teacher from when I was a senior in high school. Doc, if you're watching, thank you very much for making us that textbook back in 2014, because I found it on my hard drive a couple months ago, and I absolutely utilized every bit of it to tie this into history.
Wait, make a textbook? Your teacher made a textbook?
Yeah, she's crazy. She's so smart. She saw how much, one, textbooks are, and two, she's like, they're so useless for how much money that you pay for them. So she did all of the research of the textbooks that she knew, and she compiled excerpts out of all of her textbooks and then summarized them into like little one-paragraph snippets of what we needed to know.
Oh my gosh.
And, yeah, it gave us a 200-plus page textbook that had all of AP European history that'd be actually utilized on the exam.
Wow.
I got a 5, so.
That's crazy. I don't remember what I got. I probably got like a 4. I definitely passed it, but I don't remember doing that well, or the test being pretty difficult.
Yeah, that's why I'm the one doing the actual screenwriting, because the difference between a 4 and a 5 is a direct representation of our intelligence.
Well, I should say that you did invent all of this history. You didn't have to know a lot of history to write this. So you could have just made all this up about New South Wales and all this. I don't know.
No, this is all 100% accurate.
I'm not fact checking you.
This is 100% accurate.
Okay.
I can't physically release misinformation. Everything I say is true.
Yeah. So in general, what was your reaction to our last conversation about the treasure company?
I took a lot of what we said last time to heart about its age and its prestigiousness, and I felt it needed to be a little bit older than the century that we talked about, not necessarily formally as a company itself, but the founder and the way that the competition had evolved throughout time. By tying it to history and these historical landmarkers and actually thinking about it in terms of generations, it paved the way to influence the game masters and how the game is involved just in general.
Yeah, which I'll just give one last reminder before we get into it. None of this has to necessarily show up in the script that we're writing.
Most likely, none of it. We'll see. Well, I don't even want to introduce it anymore. I just want to hop into it.
Okay. Yeah, let's jump into it at the beginning, and finally I get to take a little step back and let you do some presentation. So why don't you take it away?
All right. 1796.
Oh my God, I'm already falling asleep.
Okay. Benedict Linwood, a brash, firm, and well-educated.
Wait, I have a note. Benedict?
Yes.
I'm not so sure about Benedict. Continue.
Okay. Well, sure.
Totally arbitrary notes from the network executive.
Is it because of Cumberbatch? Is it because of... Okay. I was thinking more Arnold.
Well, who was Arnold?
He was a traitor.
He was a traitor?
A turncoat. Maybe traitor's too harsh.
Okay. We'll investigate that.
Okay. Benedict Linwood, a brash, firm, and well-educated young man, arrives in New South Wales, Australia, to help establish a British penal colony because of that sweet colonization the British love. He assigns duties to convicts and manages the colony in a minor leadership position. He He's respected by his peers, but not very well liked, as he often gives them the frustrating tasks he doesn't want to complete himself. Linwood is a master of escaping conflict, often pitting multiple parties against themselves that would be unified against him. 1801. Albert Cockrell, a wide-eyed and adventurous young man. Do you have a comment on that name?
Cockerel? No, that's great. It's hilarious.
Thank you. Albert Cockrell, a wide-eyed and adventurous younger man, joins the colonization effort under Linwood. Fascinated by Australia's terrain, he often spends his free time exploring the continent and discovering its offerings. He becomes a guide to other colonizers, bringing them to various magnificent views and deep caverns. His friends and colleagues love his childlike enthusiasm for nature. They often accompany him on adventures, disregarding the instructions of Linwood. 1802. Cockrell disappears one day, leaving only a single clue of his whereabouts under his pillow. The inaugural scavenger hunt is born, and the prize is a breathtaking hike, something like the Crystal Shower Falls or the Chandler Walking Trail. Now we have 1802 to 1807, the Cockrell era. Cockrell's voyages become the favorite pastime of the Brits and emancipated convicts that live in Linwood's colony. A small group of around 10 people await his annual disappearance and first clue, which take place randomly without any warning. In this time, Linwood grows increasingly jealous of his younger counterpart, as Cockrell has become well revered by his constituents. Linwood refuses to participate in the hunt, often punching those who break away from the colony and their duties to pursue these adventures. Cockrell, aware of his growing popularity, playfully prods Linwood on the issue, claiming that Linwood simply isn't intelligent enough to decipher the clues. And then, 1808. Much to the surprise of his peers, Linwood competes in this year's hunt. A cunning and clever man, he dominates this year's contest, gaining an early advantage that sets him well in front of his competitors. The end location for this year's hunt is the Three Sisters Walk, a beautiful mountain hike with seemingly endless views of Australian terrain. When the first runner reaches the Three Sisters, neither Linwood nor Cockrell are there. The runners are certain this is the final clue, and they search for their game master to no avail. It seems Cockrell has vanished without a trace. Weeks pass, and Cockrell never returns home. When pressed about his route in the scavenger hunt, Linwood claims that he abandoned the entire effort when the path required them to cross a piece of dangerous terrain. He's not one to risk his livelihood over a silly game. This satisfies his peers, for now. As New South Wales begins to destabilize in general, suspicion begins to arise among the runners that Linwood is responsible for Cockrell's disappearance. Not needing a second invitation, Linwood secretly boards a ship back to England, leaving any and all controversy behind. 1808 to 1810. Linwood returns home to find that the economic and social conditions of the Industrial Revolution have radically changed Britain. Like many in that time, Linwood lacks job security. Determined to raise himself out of the poverty of many laborers around him, Linwood develops a clever and totally original idea. Linwood scrounges enough money to purchase the clothing and appearance of a romantic genius with an unknown past. After developing the right pitch, he approaches many wealthy factory owners with an enticing opportunity. For a small sum of money, he will orchestrate a treasure hunt around England. This exclusive adventure is not for the faint of heart or the shallow of pocket. Entrants must pay £100, which is £8,000 today, charge for the opportunity to win £500, or $42,000 today. He always emphasizes that the person on the other end of the pitch would be the final contestant if they accept. The allotted 10 slots fill quickly, and the inaugural Linwood treasure hunt is underway.
Okay. Wow. So obviously in this backstory, the boldest choice that you make is the implication that our creator of the treasure hunt, Benedict Linwood, it's implied that he killed Cockerell.
Maybe.
Well, it is implied.
Yeah.
So, what led you to make that decision? That's the boldest decision here.
So it sort of influenced the later point about him assuming the appearance of a romantic genius, which was a point that you had made of you wanted Linwood to be a very manipulative organization. And for me, that needed to start with its founder. One of the first things I thought about is Linwood being a master of escaping conflict. And this seemed like another way for him to escape conflict, is just to make this murder happen and find a way to stop this cornering that he was feeling of, all the people that I'm supposed to be commanding and leading and having them do these tasks that I don't want to do, they're now starting to turn against me because there's a more likable person. But also part of what I wanted Linwood to be was a clever and cunning man, which is somebody that could convince people that he is likable. So I imagine him as a true sociopath, somebody who is able to put on those emotions and that mask without feeling anything like that in general.
Right, because it makes him not inherently clever in the sense of an academic. That's not the background you gave him. It's more clever in the act of not even showmanship, because I think the recent movie Nightmare Alley comes to mind, where someone's basically, their whole thing is smoke and mirrors.
Yep.
And playing people through charisma. But that's not even necessarily what he has, because what he's doing is more behind the scenes manipulation than actually being a showman.
Yeah, and that was also something that we had talked about Linwood in general is just hands off, right? And the showman aspect would be, going out there and really trying to entertain throughout the entire time. But Linwood in general is somebody who wants to just set this up, get his money, and leave. And I wanted to still have those same principles as somebody who would be a carny setting up a circus, but not the one performing, just the one creating the space for these things to happen and then letting everyone else do the work that they have to do.
He is a Dick Cheney, not a Joel Osteen.
Precisely.
Yeah. He's the person who's more willing to use someone else as a puppet by having them go through the things that they have set up than to be this charismatic face who's manipulating people. You do kind of allude to that where you say that he's able to convince people to become contestants and that they might win. It's a small point, but in his character development, I would actually say we would cut that. Here's your sentence. He always emphasizes that the person on the other end of the pitch would be the final contestant if they accept. I think his appeal that he's creating is through mystique and intrigue rather than conmanship.
So this feels too salesman-y?
Yeah. Just because he does a lot with what he doesn't say by being withholding of information, not overfeeding you, saturating you with information.
I could see that.
Okay. All right. So then I think we should move on.
Now, I hesitate to call it a prelude, but it's not necessarily the company itself. It is just the foundation of the company following Benedict as the one person. But the rest of the timeline has been broken up into eras of how the company has been perceived and sort of what they were attempting to do with the clues, the hunts, their monetary value, all that. So we will begin with Linwood Treasure Company's first era, from 1810 to 1838, the industrial exploration. Benedict Linwood coordinates extremely celebrated treasure hunts around Great Britain. Taking a leaf out of Cockrell's book, Linwood leads his contestants up and down the country to the most magnificent of views. Though the tasks aren't as intensive, the clues of every race are as crafty as the game master himself, building a base of Linwood fanatics eager for the yearly competition. The number of contestants steadily grows from 10 to 30, and the prize pool always remains 50-50. During this era, Linwood recognizes the formidable business he has designed. Wanting to ensure its longevity, he marries the daughter of a wealthy aristocrat and has 4 children that can all succeed his tenure as a board, rather than just a singular mind. From oldest to youngest, they are Elizabeth, Thomas, Oliver, and Margaret. In 1838, at the age of 58, Benedict Linwood dies, leaving the Linwood Treasure Company to his family.
Yeah, so I think it's interesting that in this era, this is the start of actually commercializing the thing that he saw in New South Wales, which was the sense of intrigue and adventure. And I think it sort of plays to people's own main character syndrome, where they want to think of themselves as this heroic adventurer who overestimates their ability to navigate clues to actually beat out other people. And there's just the inherent competitiveness of people and monetizing that.
Yeah, which is why the contestant number grows slowly over that period, and still having it every year because it's not as intensive as we'll see in the later years. It's just going around, and now as the Industrial Revolution is expanding and this country itself is becoming easier and easier to navigate, there's definitely regions in which have already been explored, but it's the manner in which you go about finding those areas. So that was Linwood's whole idea behind this specific era. And then for me, the thing that you haven't touched on, but was the more influential part for me, was the plan for the future. In my mind, Linwood had seen what could happen from his early days of running this and what happened in New South Wales, how everyone just banded together and had so much fun doing it, that he was looking centuries in advance. He was looking at pretty much the current day that we are observing in this competition. So that's why he deliberately had these heirs, and his whole expectation was that they would take over his operation, which is kind of what happens.
Okay. So why don't you continue with them taking over.
Okay. Era 2, from 1843 to 1873, the Romantic Era. After a brief hiatus while the Linwood children come of age, the Linwood Treasure Company reopens its operation in 1843. In order to develop a more comprehensive adventure, the Linwoods opt to make the competition a biennial affair, meaning once every 2 years. To compensate for the loss of revenue, the entrance fee and total amount of available slots rise to £500 and 50 competitors. Those formerly on the outskirts now begin their preparations for the competition. Seeing as most corners of Britain have been effectively explored, the direction of the treasure hunt changes to reflect the social landscape of the time. While traveling the country is certainly still required, the clues now focus on more intellectual and artistic challenges. Art, music, and history were often referenced in clues, while the structure itself of the hunts could be loosely attributed to well-known chess games of the time. Think something like Morphy's opera games, I know you know this, big chess guy yourself. Usage of sacrifices and tempos, someone might leave material at this location in order to finish the clue elsewhere in a different spot. You can't take anything at face value anymore in these types of competitions. So, in 1863, the Barnes family, headed by Father William, becomes the first competitor to sneakily assemble a team for the competition, bringing together experts in numerous fields to decode clues faster. Though they dominated the competition for the next 4 cycles, they were all eventually banned once Linwood discovered it wasn't the sole genius of William. Throughout Era 2, the Linwood children organized the hunts without much conflict. This is often thought of as the golden era of treasure hunts, as each Linwood brought a unique interest to the table with the same cleverness as their father before them. It wasn't until Elizabeth and Oliver died of disease that any disagreements between the Linwoods arose. As Thomas and Margaret aged, the generational gap introduced competing directions for the company that would trickle into the following era.
Yeah, so what's interesting in this era is that we're advancing the actual methodology of the treasure hunt, and I think that's the start of the treasure company trying to stay a step ahead of the competitors. But do you think that it's in this era or the next that people are actually starting to compete like it might be their business, like it might be their job?
It's this one. And I hadn't specified this in the timeline, but at this point it was only solo competitors. And it's not that there was a rule against it. It was, again, that gamesmanship. It's we're all competing on an equal playing field. But Barnes was the first person to be like, oh, you know what? I can't do all this. And I know I can't do all this, but there's a pretty hefty prize at the end of it. So I'm pretty sure, I might be disqualified if I have a team, but they don't need to know that. And this is the first instance of, Linwood is being outsmarted. And once they figure out that they're being outsmarted, they immediately change course. And they completely ban them from ever competing again. That
structure is basically a comeback in the incumbent. It's basically an allusion to this idea that we have for an incumbent team later on.
What it was more for me was seeing how Linwood would respond to somebody outsmarting them. But I think at this point they had started to turn the gears of, okay, while we were definitely a company beforehand, a small business, if you will, quote unquote, but now it's turning into something much more. It's turning into its own little economy.
Okay. I think with that, you can continue.
And now we move into Era 3, global expansion, from 1875 to 1929. As the Second Industrial Revolution spreads and all of Europe becomes more interconnected, Linwood seizes the opportunity for a massive expansion. In 1875, for the first time, clues are not confined to England, but are spread around Europe in cities and towns alike. In a surprising turn of events, Linwood now allows and encourages entrants to compete in teams. The standard entrance fee for a single contestant decreases to £200, which is about $24,500 today, with the entrance for teams being placed at $500 or $61,000 today. They also expanded 250 total slots on a first-come, first-served basis. While Thomas Linwood advocates for more of the same style treasure hunt, which is focusing on romantic principles, Margaret fights for the inclusion of more contemporary clues focusing on scientific and philosophic discoveries of the time. Their debates, coupled with the difficulties of expanding into a much larger geographic enterprise, create half-baked treasure hunts that leave contestants unsatisfied. For the first time in its history, Linwood Treasure Co. is unable to field the entire field of contestants in 1903. When Thomas dies unexpectedly the following year, Margaret assumes full control of the company. She does her best to restore its reputation by expanding even further across the globe, inviting American competitors for the first time. Still, growing international conflict, including World War I, greatly diminishes interest in the scavenger hunt. While there appears to be a resurgence in the mid-1920s, the collapse of the American stock market is the final nail in Linwood's coffin. With many of her most loyal patrons facing financial ruin and the world staring at the kindling of another impending war, Margaret officially steps away from the Linwood board. She leaves sole ownership of the treasure company to her 2 children after cutting out all of her siblings' children and dies only a few years later.
So from this era, the one thing that stood out to me was, you say, well, there appears to be a resurgence in the mid 1920s. I do think the 20s would be a really interesting time. The Gilded Age would be an interesting time because we're sort of leaving this era of global colonialism, and people have all this extra money and wealth. There's a lot of new money. And I could see a lot of people, rich people in the 20s, wanting to sort of role play adventurer as the world is basically leaving that era of cowboys and colonialism and East India Trading Company and all that kind of thing.
Yeah, we see definitely I don't want to say changing of the guard, but the whispers of it with the invitation of the Americans, right? Because as America's arriving truly onto the world stage with the First World War, I think that's starting to bring its way into the treasure hunt as well. So I think the 20s would have been the time where, as the Linwood board themselves would be like, oh, we're finally getting some sort of traction again. Because I think the turn of the century and World War I itself was definitely the lowest point for the company. I think there was just too much international conflict. There was too many uncertainties to really make this a worthwhile competition for a lot of competitors. But I think if it hadn't been for the collapse of the stock market, they could have actually had their full resurgence. But it was just too much to overcome.
It's actually really funny. After World War I, sort of the spread of the Spanish flu happened because of World War I. It would have been really funny if like people traveling for Linwood to the most remote reaches of the world like spread the Spanish flu.
Oh, definitely. Even in New South Wales, while they're going through and affecting all these regions, they're definitely going into indigenous areas and bringing their illnesses with them and not even thinking about it. They are causing mass destruction just for their own enjoyment of going to see these really cool areas or just going to make money. But all of that considered, Linwood takes a small bit of a hiatus after 1929. So, Era 4, the Incumbent Era, from 1948 to 2014. And Linwood is back, baby. As the dust settles from World War II, Linwood hits the scene with a brand new look. Margaret's children, who were desperate to keep their wealthy lifestyles without needing to do a fraction of her work, restructured Linwood's entire corporate proceedings, including a move of their headquarters from its British roots to the Cayman Islands. The competition itself is also heavily reorganized. Instead of designing the treasure hunt themselves, they will appoint official game masters, which are league commissioners that will be cycled every few competitions, to lead a team of developers for a fully globalized treasure hunt. This also comes with a dramatic price increase. After transitioning to US dollars, each entry is now $5,000 or $76,000 today, though the competition will now take place every 4 years. The field's expanded to 1,000 total contestants, which will be selected by a completely randomized raffle. There's only one confirmed slot. Whoever wins will be given automatic entry to the following competition. Linwood has officially left the family business feel aside in favor of a robust, well-oiled machine. Much like the original Linwood children, each new game master leaves their own signature mark on the treasure hunt. Clues now range across more locations, studies, and tasks than ever before. They've become increasingly more physical as travel by land, sea, and air is an essential pillar to the hunt. Gone are the days of the solo entrant. There's simply no way to win without at least one other person. For the first 2 decades, there's excellent parity amongst the competitors. Even with the auto bid, there are no repeat winners. Interest grows, and thousands of teams apply every year to compete. Over the course of this era, the contest as a whole begins to change. By the late 1980s, the days of honesty and sincerity have been thrown out and replaced with ruthless greed. A scavenger hunt to see beautiful pieces of earth now results in countless towns and cities being overwhelmed and ransacked by covetous brutes. Year after year, Linwood finds itself embroiled in countless scandals from missing persons to outright destruction, yet the drama only increases the engrossment. Now, I referred to this as the Incumbent Era, even though I don't mention them in this, but I kind of allude to it with the auto bid and the no repeat winners up until probably around the 60s or 70s. We'll definitely take all the time we need to get into the Incumbent, which will be next episode for real this time. But this is where I see they really come into power. And it seems with what I imagined was basically in that hiatus, that about 20-year hiatus, basically the Linwood children were kind of running focus groups of, okay, what do we think will work best for this treasure hunt? What's going to make us the most money without needing to do any of the work? And what they arrived at are all these rule changes and regulation changes that paved the way for this to be a more commercialized treasure hunt.
Yeah, and that sort of fits in with the think of like the rise of ad men in the 50s, think of like the heavily corporate era in the 1980s, think of like the rise of reality television in the 90s. It's all through this that there's sort of the descent into the thing that they've become today. As long as we're not losing that character development of Linwood leaning on their history, leaning on creating intrigue and mystique by not being too communicative, I think that it still tracks how they've evolved.
Yeah, they're definitely not a forward-facing company by any means. So they're sticking to that section of their history of still being hands-off and still being extraordinarily clever and fascinating to the competitors themselves. But they've definitely said goodbye to the gamesmanship. They've said goodbye to the politeness of the competitors, and they've really assumed a no rules, no holds barred approach. It's really whatever goes, and by distancing themselves in the amount of competitions every 4 years, it gives them time to really let the fire and the dust settle and then do it all over again.
Yeah, and I think with this allusion to the incumbent, I mean, that dramatically is going to change the Linwood company itself after that, because it basically creates this thing that we follow through all the way to our story, which is that they have finally sort of met their match.
Yep.
And created this system with the auto bid where unintentionally they're just stuck in this loop where it's starting to feel uncompetitive. And I would assume that by the time we've reached our story, which we're sort of thinking 2018 era, something like that.
Yeah.
Modern times. They've had this fall off a bit where, the game has gotten more and more complicated as they've tried to outsmart the incumbent, but it's also led to a decline in interest because the competitiveness has seemingly vanished.
Every year is a rapid evolution, much like we're seeing now, where the differences between 1980 and 2005 are obviously crazy, but from 2005 until now is exponentially different. So I think that's how the competition has continued to grow as well.
Yeah, and you would have to imagine that with especially the rise of the internet and the ubiquity of communication, that's going to change the game again. And all of this is probably something we need to have in mind as we actually have to do the hard work of crafting the actual treasure hunt that we're going to be following.
Yeah.
I think that one thing that we're going to have to sort of sleep on is how we actually want to position the treasure company in terms of its neutrality. Like, do we want it to really represent colonialism or something? Or do we want it to just be more or less neutral and just the foundation of the storytelling? Because, I see that throughout history, it's sort of changed, and it's harder to pin down for me just with the sort of diversity of its different eras. So I think that we'll just need to think on that a bit more and how that's actually going to play into our story.
I think there are certain aspects that can be defining characteristics for the company as a whole. I just don't want to tie it too heavily into an allegory because I like its shifting nature. Because in my mind, and I don't know how you feel about this, they have a net negative moral impact on the world.
Yeah.
I think while it should be fun that they're a treasure hunt and they're this great company, with that comes the destruction of so many different resources and so many different populations and areas. It's just, there's no way to escape it. So I think by having them not be a true allegory, we get to play with what exactly it is that they're making happen.
Yeah, so at this point, we haven't really introduced the idea of a grant team, the scholarship or the courtesy team. So I think that depending on how we want to utilize something like that in our story, we'll have to go back and sort of place the origins of that idea, which is essentially a response to the elitism of the
Right.
company.
Yeah, this timeline is certainly going to evolve. I tried to not even get into specific treasure hunts at all, like the years themselves that they happen, because there are definitely little moments that we can look back through and decide, oh, we want the 1897 hunt to have this small little thing that happened that changed the course of the next 100 years.
Right. Like I mentioned, that I think it'd be really fun lore for 1 year's treasure hunt to never be solved, never be found.
Yeah, exactly. So incorporating that when we can find the proper place to use that for a character trait further down the line, we can then come back to this timeline and plug it in and make sure that it makes sense. But for now, this timeline it's just the rough skeleton. It's only going to grow more and more. And as we introduce the incumbent in the next episode and seeing where they fit into this and how they were able to cause this domination of this second or this fifth era, that's all going to get filled in as we go along.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we'll wrap it up, and I would just encourage you to join us next time when we start to continue the timeline into this era where one team manages to consistently outsmart Linwood themselves.
Should we get into a little audience feedback?
Yeah. So every episode we want to start incorporating feedback from the audience, and it's no surprise that the show's not too big right now. So if you are listening, we would really encourage you to either DM us on Instagram, comment on YouTube, or now we're introducing the option for you to leave us a voicemail. So that phone number, it's on your screen if you're watching, or it's linked in the description.
It's right here.
That phone number is 424-245-0601. Leave us a voicemail, and we can play it on the show like we're about to for our very first piece of feedback. This voicemail comes to us from Austin. Here it is.
Hey guys, it's Austin. Love everything you guys are doing. I'm a big fan of the show. And I just wanted to check in with some ideas. My first one was maybe when you get the first hint of the treasure hunt, there's also a theme every year. So maybe it's like certain cultures around the world or certain modes of travel that you have to kind of focus on to get closer to the prize. Something like that I think could be interesting. And my other idea was scene location, maybe the Bonneville Salt Flats, because it's very visually striking to me, and I think it'd be really cool to have a scene there. So yeah, that's it.
Thank you, Austin.
Thank you very much, Austin. All right, so the two ideas he gave there are sort of theming the treasure hunts every year, and then the Bonneville Salt Flats as a pitch for a location.
Wow, this location is insane.
Yeah, with that mirror, when there's a little bit of water there, that would be a great location.
Part of what we haven't really gotten into yet, because we're just focusing on character, are the locations themselves. But this is a location, to me already, that is evoking the sort of feeling that I want from the specific clues.
Mm-hmm.
Especially because this is such a beautiful natural landscape that imagining tons of people coming in here and just stomping all over it and immediately trying to destroy it feels pretty in line with what we're looking at.
Yeah, and then some little nice C plot of a conflict with like a ranger or something would be great. And then what do you think of the idea of theming every year? Is that something you think the game masters would do?
I definitely think there's a theme for every year. I just think the game masters themselves would have the overarching themes that come to define their sections of where they're in charge. So I definitely think they would theme certain elements. I think about it a lot as like an Amazing Race season where they kind of hit a linear arc of, okay, this makes sense of how we're moving from this point to this point to this point. I don't ever see it being, or maybe this is something we could play with. It could be completely randomized in the way that they go from different area to different area. But I definitely think there would be themes to help, guide the competitors. But I think this is also, we're going to get into how the hunt itself is actually laid out. So I think this is something we can certainly play with. But I don't know. What do you think?
I don't really know yet, because whatever that theme might be might just be that, well, even though it starts out, the idea is that it's worldwide, it ends up being a very Egyptian year, and it's sort of most of the treasure hunt actually ends up taking place in Egypt, and it's not just going around the whole planet. The whole planet is the play area, but I think that it could start to focus down on a certain place or a certain subject matter, like geology is sort of the theme, where different rock formations are kind of embedded in the clues. So yeah, I think it's just something to keep in mind.
Yeah, I think too that travel is a really interesting aspect of this, because travel doesn't necessarily mean the people traveling. It could be whatever they're following has been an item that has traveled, or been, as we were saying earlier with Indiana Jones, the like stolen artifacts that have been moved across the globe just for visibility's sake. That's a piece of another country's culture that has just been moved completely. So it could be an Egyptian themed year, and one of the things could be finding where something from Egypt has been taken and placed elsewhere. And while they're convinced that they should just be staying in the same country, it could require this travel at another point.
Yeah. And then there's also one comment I wanted to read. This comes to us from Pablo.
Pablo texted me this, so thank you for listening and giving me your thoughts.
So Pablo says, Linwood in my head is a mix of East India Trading Company, Monsanto, hedge fund companies, and just a tiny bit of Freemasons.
And I honestly agree completely.
Yeah, I think the Freemasons comparison is great, because that's the level of sort of secrecy around it that I want to be formed. And there definitely need to be like conspiracy theories.
Yeah, and I think East India Trading Company is definitely the early roots completely. And I agree with the other two as well, of just this domineering force.
Destructive like Monsanto, extractive hedge fund companies. Yeah, completely.
So thank you, Pablo. You summarized that better than I could.
And you're the writer.
That's it. I don't really know what I'm doing. I'm just here to put pen to page.
Well, and I'm the host. And as your host, I'm going to wrap up this episode. So thank you so much to everybody who sent in comments and voicemails. We definitely invite you to do that, to engage with us in the YouTube comments or on our Instagram. We're just at Plot Matrix. Thank you for watching today. Your hosts are myself, Jackson Casimiro, and Brian Smail III. This is a production of Lunation Lab. Learn more at lunationlab.com.
Thanks for watching.